And we are going to test our login validator. Let's have a look at the validator. It's a login.js, and this is a standard Express middleware. It imports a login schema from validation schemas. So let's check out the validation schemas, and there we have our login schema. It uses a package called yup, which we absolutely do not care about. That's not the focus of the test, but it's good to understand exactly what this package validates. It checks if the data passed into it contains an email, which must be a string and a valid email, and it also contains a password, which must be a string, a minimum of 6 characters, a maximum of 10 characters, and must be available. So our login validator imports this schema, calls the schema validates on the data from request.body, and if everything is fine, it returns next. But if things go wrong, then it returns a 422 status code with a JSON response. So our aim is to test that this middleware works exactly as we want it to be. But we don't have an Express instance. In fact, this middleware is just a function that exists out of the Express instance. So we are going to create a new folder called validators in our server folder, and here we are going to have a login.spec.js, and this is what it means to have completely unit test, because we are going to test this login.js as a separate unit from the whole application. Now the first thing to do is to define a jest environment. Jest environment is node. Next, we need to import the validator itself. So import login validator from validators/login. Next, we'll describe the test, which is the login validator, and it should call the next function when validation succeeds. The aim of this test is to make sure that when everything is successful, the next function is actually called, because in an Express application, this works as a middleware, and if the next function is not called, then the application is stuck. So we have to make sure the next function is called if the validation was successful. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that when we are calling this function, we pass in request, response, and next. So let's set up our request. Like we said, we want this to pass. So we are going to pass in request, and then we pass in body, and then we pass in email, which is a valid email, and then we pass in a valid password, because remember, we want the validation to pass. So this is 8 characters, and this matches our schema, which says a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 8, and it's required. Okay, so that's our body data. So we've mocked out the request to be exactly what it's going to be if Express is the one passing it in. Okay, so this is out of the main application, and we are mocking out specific parts that are needed for the test. Then we also need to mock out the response object, even though it's not going to be used in this test because our test is going to be focused on this try block. We are going to simply assign it to an empty object. Finally, what are we going to do with the next function? First, we need to be able to spy on this function to make sure that it is called. So to create a spy with jest, we simply need to do jest.function. Now this is what we call a mock. Now how are we going to handle the next function? We need to mock it out so that we will be able to tell if this function was called during our test or wasn't called. So we are going to say constant next is equal to jest.fn, and this is going to create a completely mocked function using jest. And with this function, we are going to be able to monitor if this function was called, the number of times it was called, the arguments it was called with, and so on. So now the final step is to call this method. It's an async function, so I'll make this async, and I'm going to say await login validator, and I'll pass in request, response, and next. Now we need to expect that this function was called, so we are going to say expect the next function, and then we have an assertion code to have been called. Now let's run our test, and our test passes successfully. Now what if we go to the middleware and comment out the line of code that calls this function? Now we run our test again, and we see our error that says expected mock function to have been called, but it was not called. And this is really great because we know in our application, if something happens or at some point the next function isn't called, the whole API is going to break and the server is not going to respond with anything. And now successfully our unit test for the login is telling us that something is wrong. So if we run our test one more time, great, we have that successful.